right, we're back with Dictatorship to Democracy. Now, I would like to do a nice long streak of videos on this, kind of unbroken, so hoping that I can bring that to you over the course of the next several days or a month-ish. Today, we're going to talk about Chapter 2, The Dangers of Negotiations. All right, so this starts on page 9. Basically, to sum up this bit until about halfway through page 10, Gene Sharp is saying, so you want to negotiate with a dictator. Now, obviously, there's a lot of good information here. You know, you really should read this whole textbook, but you're not watching this video to read the whole textbook. You're watching this video to get my notes. So we're going to go to page 10. Right. All right, so the point is, when considering negotiating with a dictator, when the issues at stake are fundamental, affecting religious principles, issues of human freedom, or the whole future development of society, negotiations do not provide a way of reaching a mutually satisfactory solution. All right. So this is basically the whole story, guys. When you have a dictatorship, you will always have unacceptable human rights abuses. You will always have issues at stake that are fundamental, affecting religious principles, issues of human freedom, or the whole future development of the society. And as long as you have a dictatorship, negotiations do not provide a way of reaching a mutually satisfactory solution. Just the rule of thumb, you could probably just sum up this entire chapter with that sentence. But we'll get into it a little bit more because we're not just gonna talk about it that little bit, okay? Gene Sharp goes on, of course, to suggest ways to convert dictatorships into democracies. Only a shift in power relations in favor of the Democrats can adequately safeguard the basic issues at stake. Such a shift will occur through struggle, not negotiations. This is not to say that negotiations ought never to be used. The point here is that negotiations are not a realistic way to remove a strong dictatorship in the absence of a powerful democratic opposition. Now that last bit is a little bit encouraging. A powerful democratic opposition. You know, I still believe that today in the United States of America, we do have a powerful democratic opposition. It may not really feel like it right now, but I think it's there, and we're coming. The North will rise again. Okay, so Gene Sharp goes on a little bit later, talks some more about that. This whole chapter is about that, but we're just going over my notes, the stuff that I think is most important here. So, Gene Sharp says on the next page, the offer by a dictatorship of peace through negotiations with the democratic opposition is, of course, rather disingenuous. All right, so, I mean, why not? Why not negotiate, right? If you can, like, it's just another way to try to force your issue, right? Negotiation is just another way to try to get yourself closer to your goals, right? Well, I mean, not if it's a trap. Not if you believe that you're going to get something and then you just end up getting taken. You know, imagine a drug deal. Drug deal is a negotiation, right? The dictator, he buys your drugs and then he pulls his gun out and then he takes your money. So like, what negotiation are we having here? Why would we negotiate with that guy? And later on, he continues to say, on the other hand, when the opposition is exceptionally strong and the dictatorship is genuinely threatened, the dictators may seek negotiations in order to salvage as much of their control or wealth as possible. In neither case should the Democrats help the dictators achieve their goals. So, in the case where the Democrats end up getting the upper hand, the dictators, they always attempt to negotiate at that point. You see it in the movies, right? This is this trope where the bad guy's down and suddenly he's begging for his life, or he's offering all these incentives to not punish him or not do whatever the good guy's trying to do. Uh it's real. It's real. They'll really do that. It will really happen. Okay, when the dictatorship becomes weak and they know they're on the way out, they will attempt negotiations, and these should never be taken in good faith. And the Democrats should, when the Democrats are in charge, they should never help the dictators achieve their goals. And the smart dictators, they know this, man. They know this. So like, they're not gonna play nice, dude. They're not gonna play nice. Okay. So this whole idea of negotiating with a dictator, just in from every aspect, from every perspective, it seems dubious. But that isn't to say it's completely without merit. The idea of negotiations, there's an infinite uh, set of circumstances that people can find themselves in, and sure, negotiations are should be a piece on the table for the Democrats. It's just, they have to be, they're really extremely careful, and most of the time the negotiations really isn't going to be it. It's it's just not going to be it. All right, so at the bottom of this page, Gene Sharp summarizes the only proper role of negotiation may occur at the end of a decisive struggle in which the power of the dictators has been effectively destroyed and they seek personal safe passage to an international airport. I mean, Gene Sharp here is really putting it quite bluntly. The only negotiation you should do with a dictator, if your society is so polite, is their means of exile. And if you watched my video on Hemmed in Ground and the River of Death, then you'll better understand what exile means and who it applies to, because it's not just the dictator. So it's pretty clear that Gene Sharp is not really a fan of negotiating with dictators, and finds that the appropriate circumstances are very rare and often occur only after the struggle has been concluded. On page 12, Gene Sharp further explains. Negotiation does not mean that the two sides sit down together on a basis of equality and talk through and resolve the differences that produce the conflict between them. That is not negotiation. Okay, that's like resolution, conflict resolution. But negotiation is not conflict resolution. It's not a discussion based on equality. And of course, he goes on. Two facts must be remembered. First, in negotiations, it is not the relative justice of the conflicting views and objectives that determines the content of a negotiated agreement. Second, the content of a negotiated agreement is largely determined by the power capacity of each side. So, I mean, what are we negotiating for? We're trying to demonstrate our power and enforce our will. And that goes true for the Democrats, that's true for the dictators. So it's not, I mean, you can't expect fairness. It's just not a game where one can expect fairness. A settlement is not reached in negotiations through an assessment of the rights and wrongs of the issue at stake. While those may be much discussed, the real results in negotiations come from an assessment of the absolute and relative power situations of the contending groups. All right, so we're reiterating here. Negotiation and settlement of a negotiation is not going to be reached by assessing rights and wrongs. The real path to a successful negotiation includes measurement of powers between two parties. In other words, if an agreement comes, it is more likely the result of each side estimating how the power capacities of the two sides compare and then calculating how an open struggle might end. So there is an opportunity in negotiation to avoid open struggle. But we're assuming a lot of negotiation here, saying that. So on page 13, Gene says, no one should ever forget that the dictators may promise anything to secure submission from their democratic opponents and then brazenly violate those same agreements. If you're going to negotiate with a dictator, you have to expect that they're not going to want to honor the negotiation. So, I mean, you need to be able to enforce the limitations of your negotiation. If you can't enforce the limitations of your negotiation, then it is extremely likely that the dictator is going to abuse the negotiation. And on page 14, right at the bottom here, Gene recalls Aristotle. It says, long ago, oligarchy and tyranny are shorter lived than any other constitution. All round, tyrannies have not lasted long. So Gene is starting to explain to us that tyranny of dictatorship is not going to last long. Any dictatorship that does have some staying power is, they have a limit on their tyranny. They know that their power comes from the people, and if they're too tyrannical, then the people will take that power from them. Right? And on page 15, which is the final page of Gene summarizes. Recent history shows the vulnerability of dictatorships and reveals that they can crumble in a relatively short time span. Whereas 10 years were required to bring down the communist dictatorship in Poland, in East Germany and Czechoslovakia in 1989, it occurred within weeks. In El Salvador and Guatemala in 1944, the struggles against the entrenched brutal military dictators required approximately 2 weeks each. And he goes on, there's the majority of dictatorships are short-lived. We're talking about 1 decade, often much less. And finally, the old preconception that violent means always work quickly and nonviolent means always require vast time is clearly not valid. Again, he's referring to these very, very dictatorships which were overthrown, these tyrannies which were overthrown by nonviolent means. And that the success of nonviolent means can come quickly, less than a decade, which I guess on a cultural scale is relatively quickly. And the next chapter is Whence Comes the Power, which we can talk about tomorrow.